Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs, and become a patron today to show your support and get instant access to our extensive archive of downloadable ad-free tales of terror. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Disclaimer. Horror Hill is a horror anthology podcast bringing you scary stories from all corners of the internet and beyond. As such, certain stories include content that some listeners might find offensive. In particular, one of tonight's stories includes references to violence against children and child abuse. Listener discretion is advised. Good evening, listeners, and welcome back to Horror Hill. I'm your host, Erik Peabody, and we've got a nice little double feature for you this fine October evening. If I had to pick a theme for tonight's stories, it would be isolated locales. We have the peaceful depths of the forest, the serenity of the northern Ontario wilderness, and maybe someplace even a bit more remote. Our episode tonight opens with the wonderfully titled, "They're Not Saying It's Aliens, But It's Aliens," by the Vesper's Bell. This story deals with something that I'm sure has been on many of our minds lately, that being the increasingly frequent governmental mentions of aliens and extraterrestrial spacecraft. Our narrator in this story has also been wondering about those statements, but he has some, let's say, inside information that has cemented in his mind the reality of life beyond Earth. Then, to close out our evening, we'll read Of Emerald Towers and Crimson Children by Martinek. This story opens with our protagonist deep in the woods, searching for a serenity that has been harder and harder for him to come by. You see, as a homicide detective, our narrator has seen some of the worst examples of humanity and has found a sort of toxic solace in the violence that he can inflict upon those perpetrators. His time in the forest is a sort of confession for his acts, which he feels are justified, even if society wouldn't see it that way. However, as his story unfolds, we are left to wonder where the line actually is and what happens if it gets crossed. You're listening to the standard edition of this program. If you'd like to help support Horror Hill and also remove these pesky ads, head over to chillingtalesfordarknights.com and click Patrons in the upper menu to sign up today. You'll get instant access to hundreds of ad-free stories, and we can scale back some of our less savory means of generating money for the show. By the way, You don't happen to still have all of your organs, do you? And now, from author The Vesper's Bell, I give you, they're not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens. I'm sure you've seen the headlines by now. Seen and probably forgot about, since the news cycle has already left them behind for whatever you're supposed to be outraged about and terrified of this week. In case you actually did forget, allow me to refresh your memory. UFOs are real. The United States military has admitted it's been encountering them for decades. Sure, they prefer the slightly less stigmatized term of unidentified aerial phenomena, and they insist that they have no reason to believe they're actually alien spacecraft, but they won't rule it out either. In other words, they're not saying that it's aliens, but it's aliens. Now, I'm sure that the more skeptically inclined among you are certain that these UFOs, I beg your pardon, UAPs, are probably just some previously unknown meteorological phenomena, or even just misidentified mundane phenomena. The old swamp gas and weather balloons story, right? And even if you're willing to admit they're aircraft of some kind, they're probably just classified tech that no one wants to admit to. Because if someone did possess technology centuries beyond anything else on Earth, the last thing they'd want to do is openly capitalize on that technology, right? Well, as much as I hate to destroy those rather comforting delusions, I know for a fact that the UFOs the military are referring to are, in fact, not of this Earth in origin. I know that because I've been inside of one. It was last fall, just after dark, and I was driving through northern Ontario without another soul in sight. In retrospect, I was lost, but at the time I was too stubborn to admit that to myself and pull over to check my phone for directions. I kept telling myself I'll see a sign pointing me back towards Highway 11 sooner or later. But that's, at best, tangential to my story. All that matters is that I was driving alone and at night down a deserted stretch of barely paved road in the Canadian wilderness when my car suddenly died on me. And I mean completely and totally died. The engine, the battery, everything just cut out at once without any warning. Panicking, I slammed on the brakes, and thankfully those still worked, so I came to a stop before I flew into the ditch or went spinning out of control. Once I was stopped, though, I was stuck. I tried turning the engine back on, of course, but I couldn't even rev it. Turning the ignition accomplished absolutely nothing. I tried turning both my headlights and interior lights on and off several times, but I remained surrounded by utter darkness without so much as a flicker. After that, my first impulse was, of course, to reach for my phone, only to see that it was dead too. Had there been an EMP or something? I couldn't think of anything else that could have simultaneously caused both my car and my phone to so suddenly and completely die like that. As I sat alone in the dark, contemplating both the odds and implications of a widespread EMP attack, I was suddenly immersed in a blinding white light. It was vibrating and making this weird whooshing sound like what you hear when you put a conch shell to your ear. It was so loud that if I had been screaming, I didn't hear it. The light pulled me upwards, and I passed through my seatbelt and even my car roof like they weren't even there. I felt myself tumbling up higher and higher, faster and faster for what must have been at least several minutes, until I finally came to a stop. The intensity of the beam surrounding me subsided considerably, and I was able to get a look at my surroundings. I was in some sort of hangar, filled with a multitude of ellipsoid pods of varying sizes. Everything in sight was made from a smooth, softly glowing opalescent substance. There were no sharp angles, with all the edges and protrusions being softly curved. What stood out to me the most, however, was that the pods were parked along every side of the interior with no designated floor, walls, or ceiling, as if the entire structure had been designed for microgravity, where there was no such thing as up and down. The one exception to this was the translucent porthole beneath me, revealing that I was in a vessel very high above the Earth's surface, quite possibly in low Earth orbit. As beautiful and awe-inspiring as that view was, I didn't get to enjoy it for long. A small, faint laser or particle beam was emitted from a seemingly random point in the hangar walls, and it struck me in between the eyes. Within seconds, I lost all bodily sensation, and I realized that I'd been paralyzed. I was initially horrified, but within a few more seconds, this also passed, as the beam seemed to have had a sedative effect as well. I didn't lose consciousness, though. I was still fully aware of everything that was happening around me. I was held in place for about a minute until, presumably, my captors were convinced that I had been subdued. The beam holding me in place was released, and another beam began pushing me across the hangar and down a corridor until I ended up in an examination room of some kind. I was once again held in place by another white beam, and I found myself surrounded by 4 feminine, humanoid entities. They were each about 5 feet tall, and none of them looked like they would weigh even 100 pounds in Earth's gravity. Their skin was smooth, glossy, hairless, and strangest of all, technicolored. One of the creatures was rose, one lavender, one pink, and the other teal. They didn't wear any clothing, but their bodies were decorated by hundreds of small, luminous diodes embedded into their skin, shining like stars and arranged in gracefully curving patterns that were unique to each of them. I saw that their feet were prehensile and that they each possessed a long, prehensile tail wrapped around a shared perching ring to hold themselves in place. Their gracile fingers and toes had no nails on them, and while they did have 5 digits on each hand, in place of a pinky, they had a second thumb. There were several horizontal slits over their lower tracheas, capped with a small gem over their larynxes. On each side of their neck and above their collarbones were small, cephalopod-like siphons, which I presumed to be redundant airways into their lungs. As for their heads, these did bear a bit more of a resemblance to the standard pop culture depiction of aliens. They had pointy chins, small mouths, and noses that were hardly more than bumps with nostrils. Their eyes were big, though, with dark sclerae and large, glittering irises that matched their skin tone. They had curvilinear lines etched into them as well, and I got the impression that the eyes, or at least the lenses, were bionic. What stood out most of all, though, were their elongated skulls with elliptical, crystalline computer modules embedded into their sides, along with a smaller, teardrop-shaped module embedded into the forehead. I knew they were computers of some kind because I could see what looked like neural pathways flickering faintly inside of them. I could only assume that what I was looking at was some sort of bioengineered and cybernetically augmented species that had been designed to live and function in a 3-dimensional microgravity environment. I noted that each girl did have a navel, which presumably meant they developed in a womb at some point, either natural or artificial. Probably artificial, as I didn't see how their big heads could pass through their narrow hips. But they still seemed far too human-looking to be aliens. Sure, it was conceivable that convergent evolution might result in something vaguely humanoid evolving on an alien world, but these girls were basically Star Trek aliens, for God's sake. Did that mean that they were humans from the future, or a parallel universe, or a human subspecies that aliens had modified at some point? I still don't know the answer. The Rose Girl took notice that my gaze was lingering on her naked body in a manner that was admittedly less scientific than the description I've provided here. She arched a hairless eyebrow at me in an expression that suggested that I was not the first man she had ever met. She held up her right hand and moved her fingers about as if she was tapping some invisible buttons. Suddenly, my clothes phased through my body, just as I had phased through my car earlier, leaving me as naked as my captors. They all gave me a satisfied smile, evidently preferring that we be on an even playing field. The pink, teal, and lavender girls all snatched some of my clothing as it floated away. They examined it curiously for a moment before tossing it aside in revulsion, both its texture and scent seeming to have offended them. The rose girl, apparently the one in charge, began to speak in a melodious language, the slits over her trachea opening and closing like keys on a wind instrument. I couldn't understand a word of it, of course, but it seemed much more complex and information-dense than any natural human language, one that required superhuman memory and cognition to speak fluently. For several minutes, she seemed to be lecturing her subordinates about me, all of whom listened with rapt interest. As they spoke, another 4 of the entities floated by behind them, this group led by a goldenrod girl. They smiled at me as they passed, and I saw that some of their diodes weren't just glowing, but producing small jets of light that were effortlessly propelling them forward. Presumably, they worked on the same principle as the beam that was holding me in place. When the rose girl finished speaking, she gestured to the other 3 to move in and examine me up close. Using the same light-based propulsion as the entities that had just passed, the 3 girls jetted over to me and began to playfully probe my every nook and cranny. My hair seemed especially novel to them, and they took turns petting my head, beard, eyebrows, chest, arms, legs, and pubic region. My genitalia, on the other hand, was, humiliatingly, rather amusing to them. They seemed to think of it as a weird and short tail that was on the wrong side. On the other hand, they were at least a little impressed by my more heavily muscled frame. If these girls lived their entire lives in microgravity, extra muscle mass would only have been a waste of calories. The teal girl pulled open my jaw and began inspecting my mouth, and as she did, I saw her blink a pair of nictitating membranes over her eyes. I also noticed that behind each of her small ears there was some sort of neural port or antenna that seemed to be connected to the computer modules on her head. The teal girl soon withdrew from my mouth with the same revulsion she had shown to my clothes, and stuck to a purely external examination from there on out. She and her 2 companions prodded at my neck where their extra air holes were. They studied my one-thumbed hands, my thumbless feet, my nails, and most of all, they examined my skin. Every scar, every mole, every blemish seemed to fascinate them, not to mention that the singular gradient of brown that human skin came in was likely incredibly dull to these brightly colored beings. They cooed, sang, and giggled as they scrutinized my body until the rose girl called them back to the perching ring. They obeyed without complaint, ritualistically waving their hands over one another as their diodes glowed more brightly, likely sanitizing them. As soon as they were in place, their leader once again began tapping virtual buttons that only she could see. Vertical and horizontal scanning beams began going up and down and back and forth, over and over again as they imaged my body down to a microscopic level. I desperately hoped that these scans were benign and not made of some sort of dangerous particle radiation that modern physicists had yet to even theorize about. I tried to remain as calm as I could, telling myself that these beings were just curious and meant no harm. How malicious could a hyper-advanced species of candy-colored naked space girls really be, right? That's when another beam pierced through my chest and pulled out my heart. I know that it actually pulled my heart out and wasn't just making a hologram of it or something, because the instant I saw my heart phase out of my chest, The pounding in my ears turned into a constant, rushing stream. The beam was circulating my blood for me, keeping me on life support as the Rose Girl casually commented on my disembodied heart to her subordinates. It was still beating. I have no idea how, but the beam that was holding it was keeping it alive without me, the same as it was keeping me alive without it. I was still being scanned during all of this, presumably because they wanted to know how the fuck I would react to having my heart taken out of my fucking chest. The heart was being scanned too, with enlarged holographic projections appearing around it. A smaller beam removed a small biopsy and placed it in a crystalline, egg-shaped container that the girls all took turns examining. Then, when they were finally done with it, my heart floated back towards me, phased back into my chest, and somehow immediately reintegrated itself on a cellular level. I could feel it beating again. It would have been impossible not to, since it was beating as hard as I could ever remember it beating. But I can't even begin to fathom how that was scientifically possible. How could any technology, no matter how advanced, remove and replace bodily organs as easily as batteries in a toy car? However they did it, my heart was back where it belonged. Then, the beam moved over a few inches to the left, pulled out my lung, and the process repeated all over again. Then again, with my other lung, and then with my liver, and over and over and over again. Organs, bones, and tissues were removed, scanned, sampled, and then returned as if they'd never been gone at all. For hours, I was taken apart and put back together. It was terrifying, degrading, and exhausting, but at the very least, it wasn't painful. The beam wasn't actually doing any damage, and whatever it was doing to temporarily fill in for the missing body parts also seemed to numb the area. I still wondered why they needed or wanted me conscious for all of this, though, and there was no doubt that they knew I was conscious. It was inconceivable that their scanners couldn't tell the difference between a conscious and unconscious human, and they could clearly see my eyes frantically darting around as they vivisected me. The only explanation was that they just didn't care what they were putting me through. Eventually, the pink, teal, and lavender girls began to yawn and stretch, apparently having grown bored with the tedious work of cataloging all my innards. As the last of my organs was put back into place, the Rose Girl spoke to them in a tone that suggested they were just about finished. She put the last of the biopsies away and pulled out another crystal egg, opening it to reveal a rolled-up mesh woven from crystalline filaments. She summoned a hologram that depicted the mesh phasing into my skull, being placed onto my brain and then getting absorbed into it, its many filaments fraying into smaller strands that branched off throughout my gray matter. The vivisection beam was precisely targeted at my forehead, and when she was certain it was positioned correctly, she placed the crystal mesh into the beam. I watched helplessly as it silently floated towards me and passed through my skull without any resistance at all. The integration into my body took a little longer than it did with my own organs, the Rose Girl appearing to administer multiple system checks and subsequent recalibrations. Eventually, she got it the way she wanted it, and it seemed my ordeal was finally over. I was hoping that would mean that I would be released, but instead of going back to the hangar, a door opened straight ahead of me. The beam was pushing me forward, and my tormentors followed right alongside me. We went down a long corridor and then into a smaller lab, this one filled with human-sized crystalline pods. Human-sized because they were filled with human beings. They were all suspended in a fetal position, their scalps surgically removed to reveal a brain where the crystalline mesh had exploded into a dense tangle of fibers, growing like weeds and feeding into a series of 2-meter-tall ellipsoid crystals. The people's eyes moved rapidly beneath closed lids, revealing that even if they weren't awake, they weren't unconscious either. They were dreaming. Dreams controlled by a crystalline supercomputer, programmed by the same strange beings that had spent the past several hours vivisecting me. The 4 girls from earlier were monitoring the grisly experiment, but stopped to enthusiastically embrace the arrival of their companions. The Goldenrod girl and Rose girl greeted each other with a hug and a nuzzle before turning their attention towards me. They spoke in their complex, melodic language as the neural nets within their crystal head modules flickered more brightly, likely an indicator of information transfer. The Goldenrod girl appeared to take a moment to review the data, and then moved in to inspect me personally. Unlike the 3 girls before, whose examination of me felt like it had been driven by sheer novel curiosity, this felt like a far more practiced inspection. After scrutinizing every inch of my body, she floated in front of me and pressed her forehead to mine. The module on her forehead lit up, and for a single instant, I was bombarded with a surge of complex mental information that I couldn't possibly begin to interpret. She pulled her head back and smiled at me, patted my chest, and sang what sounded like a "this one's good" to her associate. I thought this meant I was going into one of the pods so that my brain could be used as potting soil for whatever they had stuck inside of me. In spite of my exhaustion, that horrifying prospect was enough to arouse me back to full alertness. I fought desperately to put up some kind of fight before going down, but my body just wouldn't obey. The last thing I saw was the Rose girl pressing some virtual buttons again, and then I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed over 100 kilometers from where my car would later be discovered. They had found me, naked and unconscious, outside the emergency entrance in the wee hours of the morning. Strangely enough, the security cameras had inexplicably shut down right before my appearance, so they had no idea how I had gotten there. Their first thought was that I was drunk or had overdosed on something, but I tested clean for everything. They couldn't explain why I was unconscious, and when I woke up, I was rambling incoherently about being vivisected and brain-chipped by floating, sparkly nudists from outer space. As you can probably guess, I was put under psychiatric observation. The doctors could find no evidence that my organs had been removed and put back in, and the mesh I was implanted with doesn't show up on brain scans. It's still there, though. I know because every now and then I get a sudden surge of information out of nowhere that I can't begin to understand. I know that the mesh is communicating with its mothership, sending updates and receiving new instructions. I don't know what it's doing to my brain or if it's influencing my thoughts or behaviors in any way. I do dream of them, though. Dream of parts of the ship I was never in, of members of their species I never met, participating in activities I never witnessed. I hear their language in my dreams, even though I don't know what any of it means. Well, except for one word. I think that their name for their species translates to Astra Sirena, or star sirens. I can't find any other account of alien abduction involving them, or even one where the ship didn't have artificial gravity like in every sci-fi TV show. Could it be that I'm the only person the sirens ever sent back? Or at least the only one who was conscious during the experience and allowed to keep their memories? The only thing I'm sure of is that one day, the thing they put in my head will start to sprout. And when it does, they'll be back to put me in their demented crystal garden with the others. So, please, take it from me. even though the government still isn't saying that unidentified aerial phenomenon are aliens. It's aliens. You've been listening to They're Not Saying It's Aliens, But It's Aliens by the Vesper's Bell. The Vesper's Bell is a creepypasta author who prefers to remain pseudonymous for completely unsuspicious and non-nefarious reasons. After honing a lifelong interest in creative writing through multiple endeavors, most notably the SCP Wiki, the Vesper's Bell has joined the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights writing team for the opportunity to both expand and diversify their body of work, as well as reach new and wider audiences. A longtime fan of creepypasta indie horror, the Vesper's Bell aims to become a sizable and significant contributor to the genre in the coming years. And now, from author Matt Martinek, I give you Of Emerald Towers and Crimson Children. You know that feeling you get when you're deep in the forest? Like something is watching you, maybe even following you, but of course you continue on, because it's just your imagination. Except that it's not. The feeling you have is instinctual, and you should always trust your instincts. In the forest, there are always eyes on you, too many to count. Why? Because you don't belong, and your presence makes the residents feel uncomfortable. See, the forest is pure, but man, he is not. When you step foot in the forest, you're entering the only true church. And, as we all know, when you go to church, you must confess. I kneel to the powers accordingly, no matter how righteous I may think I am at the time. The woods used to scare the shit out of me when I was a kid. Too much of the unknown, too many creepy crawlies, and the hideous noises of things I could never even begin to wrap my head around. As I grew, however, I began to look at things quite differently. The hustle of the city and the falsity of man-made things tend to give a person the wrong idea of what it means to be alive. If you trek into nature, you often see the reverse of what you've previously known to be the truth. The forest is a self-sustaining cycle of birth, flourishment, and rebirth. Death does not exist in the heavenly green. Of course, states do change, but for the greater purpose only. If a creature loses its breath, it becomes sustenance in order to strengthen the breath of others. If a modern man loses his breath, he is encased in wood, concrete, or a metal receptacle. It is a finite end of things. The rot serves no purpose, and that isn't right. Such death is only for the ignorant. With those thoughts in mind, some might find it amusing that I am a man of the law. I mean, whose law is it? Surely it's not the rule of a higher power, but more along the lines of a kind of restriction on beauty and true freedom, written up by creatures who haven't a clue. This being said, I do try my best to make the world continue to spin on an axis of morality and general good feeling. Hell, that's why I signed up in the first place. Men are not to be trusted and need to be treated as such. I bought in 100%. I made detective in just a few years. I was making a dent, and it was noticed. It's nice to be noticed, by peers or otherwise. It means you're doing your job, and that's all I ever wanted to do. I remember the searing pain of the ligaments in my knee tearing away from the bone as I kicked the door in. The little blonde-haired girl, who we had been searching for 6 weeks to be precise, screamed with a shriek that made the hairs on my neck stand on end as her captor sprang from the chair in that dimly lit kitchen, obviously startled. It was a big case, and all of Philly was searching for this girl. I hadn't slept in weeks. It was fucking with all of us. The details were terrifying. The perversions of the sexual abuse, the statements from the school, the confessions from the mother. It was one of those cases that you just can't get past. And the fact that the father fled with the girl, instead of facing the charges like a man, only made us salivate for closure even more. I swore to the heavens that he was grabbing for his piece, but he wasn't. I don't know exactly why I did it. She was found, alive, and it was over. But still, I painted the wall behind the man with the dark crimson of his brains, and felt nothing. It was during this time that I began my treks into the green, when I was at both my highest and lowest. I was applauded as a hero for bringing this girl home. It had national attention. Interview after interview, camera upon camera. I was the fucking man, no doubt about it. But the secret began to tear at me. I would hike for hours, limping along, looking for answers. I would admire the emerald spires that jutted into the sky with impunity. I daydreamed of climbing into them, up to the topmost branches, and simply staying there for days until my body would give out from starvation. The birds would violently pluck my dripping eyeballs out of their sockets and take them to their nests to share with their families. Hunters could unearth my skyward remains by the end of next fall, when the leaves would go to rest. But this act I've just described could be seen by some as cowardly, and that just ain't me. Time passed, as did bits of sanity. Amongst my peers, I became known as the man who could get things done, as well as the man who could find anyone. I began to answer interesting questions like, how many fingernails can you rip out with pliers before a pimp will talk? Or, how long does it take for a rapist to completely bleed out from a singular chest wound? I continued to make headway and continued to do my duty. The legend grew, as did my confessions. My prayers were footsteps tread into the damp soil. My communion was the mushroom patch I found below the riverbed. When times were particularly tough and actual guilt would rear its ugly head, I would dig my hands into the rotting cavities of expired animals and massage their purple entrails until the worms and ants would crawl onto me and attempt to feast on my living flesh. I was not without penance. I was at the very height of my powers and had reached the crux of popularity. I was now a public figure. I had fans, as I guess you would call them. They followed the cases, and in some instances followed me physically as well. Honestly, it became annoying. At the same time, though, it was all I had. The job became my life. I never married, never had kids. Girlfriends were few and far between. My reputation fueled me, and the fame sustained me. My confidence overflowed, along with the blood of these men which I shed in the name of justice itself. The skeletons were clawing at the door, but my bravado always kept them at bay. I couldn't stop. Her name was Madeline. Little red-haired girl, 11 years old. Taken in broad daylight, right outside her home. Her father had apparently done some bad things, and Madeline was the payback. It felt like the first time to me, when I had rescued that first little girl and blew her daddy's brains out. Kind of freaked me out a little. It was somehow more emotional to me than other cases and had my heart pumping even more than usual. As the days fell away and the severity of the situation grew, I found myself again without sleep. But I knew I would find her. I had no doubt in my mind. We were looking for any and all leads we could find. We even set up a hotline specifically for Maddie's case, but nothing much was coming in, and the things that did pop up ended up being bullshit. I think I saw her at the market. I think I saw her at the playground. Things like that. Every moment that passed was another moment of pain and doubt. I began taking longer trips into the comfort of the forest, a tainted man amongst the leaved obelisks that I had so admired. I was no longer searching for confession, however, but instead for the power and grace to bring closure to this new issue the city was facing. Most of the time, I was perched on the stone outcroppings, thinking away, or with my feet dipped in the freezing stream as I wished for baptism, as I longed for grace. I began to think about Madeline's captors and what I was going to do to them. It wasn't going to be pretty. I did have my sources on the street. Most of them couldn't be trusted, of course, but every once in a while you had a guy who knew how important it was to not burn a bridge. So, surprisingly, 7 weeks into the search for Maddie, I received a tip from an informant that the little girl was being held in an apartment downtown near the historic district. I should have alerted the department immediately, but I knew I had to go in alone. If this was a worthwhile lead, no partner on Earth would let me get away with what I was planning. And the lead was probably bullshit anyway, so I didn't want to make too big a deal out of it. So, in the middle of a rainy, filthy night in Philadelphia, I set out to find Madeline and destroy whoever it was who took her. The apartment building was decrepit and nearly unlivable. The musty smell of rot and fungus hung heavy as I moved carefully through the hallway. It was amazing to me how such tenements were able to even stand. My heart beat faster with every step until I reached what I was looking for. There it was, room 104. But something was unusual. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see that it was dark inside. Without any knock or audible warning, I pulled my gun, pushed the door open the rest of the way, and proceeded to hit the light switch. The room was empty, except for one table in the kitchen area. I could see that there was a piece of paper sitting on this table. I smelled something strange, but couldn't place it. The lump in my throat began to grow. I approached the table, afraid of what the paper might say. The note read, "Too late, you piece of trash." Every word was written in marker, but the word trash was scrawled in what looked to be brown, dried blood. Without pause, I rushed outside to the back of the building in the midst of a full-blown panic attack. Every fiber of my being was banking on my instincts being wrong, but the truth was revealed to me as I ripped and rummaged through the black garbage bags in the stinking, rusty dumpster. The scent of death hit me hard as I tore one of the bags open, and whatever heart I had left proceeded to shatter right there amongst the refuse. It reminded me of doll parts dipped in a red paint. Arm here, leg there, hands off to the side, dismantled by an angry child in a fit of rage. And there was poor Madeline's decapitated head, sitting at the bottom of the bag, her pretty blue eyes staring at me, missing the eyelids that used to accompany them. Her mouth was contorted in some sort of frightful grimace of pain, her teeth clenched tightly. I had found her. After homicide was called to the scene and I struggled to provide a coherent statement, they carted me off and drove me to a hospital where I stayed for an entire week, apparently doing nothing but sobbing, screaming, and rambling about the green and how it had failed me. I did the best I could to make it through the funeral, as I watched Maddie's parents lose their minds in front of the tiny black coffin which held the bagged portions of their murdered daughter. The situation broke me into pieces, and I was sure that I would never be able to put back together the right way again. I withdrew and retired from the force, with nothing but shame, guilt, and the memory of Madeline's bloodied parts to keep me company. What becomes of a man after he loses his identity? The man who I had prided myself on being no longer existed. I failed that girl. Not once, but twice. I failed to rescue her, but I also couldn't pull myself together enough to find her killer either. No one ever did. For all the people who I had saved, it was the one person I couldn't help who made the rest of my career meaningless. No more interviews, no more talk shows, no more facade of importance. I faded into nothingness and grew old and gray along the way. I vowed never to return to the woods. Maybe the verdant green had failed me, or maybe I was too tainted to be saved, but the one thing that I knew as truth was that death did not exist in the forest, only rebirth. It took years of feeling sorry for myself and unlimited moments of pain to piece myself back together. I did not look the same, and I did not feel the same, but I knew that there was more for me to do. My reputation was tarnished, and I wished nothing more than to get it back, to return to some semblance of the man I once was, howsoever tainted. And then it happened. Another missing girl. I was no longer a detective, but simply an old, broken-down man who wanted another shot at the past. But I figured it would be enough. It would have to be. Her name was Jocelyn. Brunette, 9 years old. Simply never came home from school one day. The media was abuzz with the details and her photo, and it began to feel like history repeating itself. I did contact some old friends at the department to see if I could get access to any leads myself, but they urged me to stay out of it, that I would only get in the way. Apparently, even after all I had done, they had forgotten about me too. Pink jumper, white and blue tennis shoes, and her photo. That's all I had to go on, but I would at least have to try. The woods had not been kind to me. I had searched for power and had received failure. I looked for purity and found guilt, but I knew that I had nothing to lose, and after much soul-searching, I decided that I would return to the green one more time. One last confession and one last pilgrimage. I set out on my usual trails, admiring the beauty that I had missed during those lost years. The perfect ecosystem, allowing me to behold the trees and stones and streams that seemed to know the secrets of humankind itself. Again, I walked for hours, thinking of every drop of blood that I spilt, and every criminal who I had dismantled in the name of righteousness. My thoughts turned to Maddie's blue eyes, staring at me from underneath her red curls. I wept until the soil around my feet was moist with hurt. After I composed myself, I moved further, beyond the trails, into places I had never been before, yet seemed strangely familiar somehow. My feet ached and my brow glistened, but I trudged on until I spotted something out of place. I saw a rusty drain pipe off to my right, about 2 feet wide, popping out of the middle of a thicket. What a crime. Such a man-made construct ruining the natural beauty around it. Very strange, I thought. I moved closer to the pipe, and nearly fainted when I realized what I had found. The shoe came into view first, then the pink dress. It was Jocelyn. Tears returned to my eyes as I got closer and saw the poor girl's contorted body crumpled up inside the pipe. Apparently, the animals had already gotten to her, as most of the skin was missing from her face and hands. The bloodied skeletal features were plainly in view. Whatever skin I could see was a transparent mush. The water coming from the pipe, mixed with the girl's remains, supplied a stream below with a steady dark brown liquid. Nature was claiming her body for its own. The police were amazed at my find. They simply couldn't believe it. As I was interviewed for the local news, it felt like old times, if even for a moment. I had found her when no one else could. I brimmed with pride as I was again the hero of the day. But deep down, I knew that I needed to return to the heavenly green for another confession. The only reason I was able to locate the body is because I was the one who had placed it there. Men are not to be trusted. You've been listening to Of Emerald Towers and Crimson Children by Matt Martinek. Matt Martinek is a singer/songwriter and author from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, whose passion is the creative process itself. Whether it's through song or the written word, Matt's works always find their audience. His writing credits include short stories for Siren's Call magazine, Hellbound Books, and Coffin Bell Journal, amongst many other publications. Well, my friends, that concludes our broadcast evening. I hope that tonight's stories have helped enhance your Halloween spirit during this fine season. As always, I'll be back next week with more chilling tales to keep you nice and creeped out. Until then, everyone, stay spooky. You've been listening to the Horror Hill Podcast, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. Tonight's episode was hosted and narrated by yours truly, Erik Peabody. Original music provided by Erik Peabody and Nikki McSorley. Finalization by N.M. Brown and S.K. Brown. Got a terrifying tale of your own that you'd like performed? Email it to us at natalie@chillingtalesfordarknights.com to have your work considered for future production. Seeing as how we're all living in a technological nightmare of our own devising, I'll ask you to follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on social media and upvote, subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon if you're listening to this on YouTube. Not only will you have appeased the dark gods of cyberspace, but you'll be kept in the loop as we prepare more terrifying content. If you'd like access to uninterrupted horror, free of ads, and these annoying bookend segments, might I recommend signing up for our Patreon? You'll get access to hundreds of episodes of this show, as well as everything else from the other programs in the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights cabal. That means all of Otis Cheery's Scary Stories Told in the Dark, Drew Blood's Dark Tales, Paul J. McSorley's Fear from the Heartland, and more. It's a veritable smorgasbord of horrific delights. As for me personally, I'm on most social media sites as Viking Guitar or Viking Guitar Productions. I'm always on the lookout for new stories to narrate and new music projects to mix or master. If that's of interest to you, feel free to reach out and we can talk turkey. Also, I will be back next week with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. If darkness is what you're after, listener, your search is over. Yet, let it be known, you haven't found the darkness. The darkness has found you.
Chilling tales for dark nights.